Welcome to A Time to Think. This is Pastor Chris Tillman, Pastor Josh Holland. We both are, we like to style ourselves as thinking people. We also feel pressure to think through some pretty big things because God has entrusted us with groups of people.
Yep.
God has entrusted you with a group of people in Stevens Point. God has entrusted me with a group of people in Wausau. And we both feel that it's in our role to help our people think through some pretty grand issues. Problem is, we only have so much time at the pulpit on Sundays, so we need a space where we can do it elsewhere, hence a time to think. Chris, today we're talking about this idea that objective exterior morality is oppressive, okay? Objective exterior morality, each word matters there. This is coming from Karl Truman's book, Strange New World. Objective meaning it's not changing based on different personalities. So subjective means you do what's good for you, I do what's good for me. Objective means we both have to do the same thing. Exterior means the reason we're doing the same thing is because someone outside of us tells us to do it. And then morality deals with what you ought or ought not to do. So objective exterior morality is Chris and Josh determine what they ought or ought not to do because of an unchanging truth outside of them. And Truman walks through Karl Marx and Friedrich Nietzsche, who first put forth the idea that this is oppressive, that exterior morality, objective morality is oppressive. Chris, how do I guess I want to bait people in to keep watching. So let's start by how we maybe see the inklings of this in our culture, and then let's go back to discuss Nietzsche and Marx.
Yeah, well, I mean, they're all kind of the same guy, just turned over in different venues. But I think the primary way we see this is in what we would say are these micro relationships that exist on the individual level. So when it comes to a relationship between a parent and a child, I'll just use that as an example, but we can include relationships between employer and employee, those types of things where authority structures traditionally have existed, and you look at this on the level of parent to child, and as somebody with several children, we don't send our kids to public school. We tend to keep them fairly sheltered from certain cultural, societal pressures and cultural and societal values that we disagree with. At the same time, it's been interesting for me as a dad to see how the life of a child has changed dramatically from when I was a kid growing up in the 80s and 90s to where things are at in the 2020s, because children are now given a certain latitude to speak about parental authority as being oppressive. So a parent is not viewed as someone who is primarily there to protect and to guide and to guard and all those types of things. Instead, the idea is if your parent stands in the way of your pursuit of happiness, throw it off. And
because your parent in that situation is the objective external morality.
Yes,
right?
Who is giving you a way to function. And I think one specific way we see this that is pretty dramatic and it's very, very disturbing is how issues of gender and sexuality are addressed in public school settings. Because public schools will then step in, and I mean, we'll talk about this later, this idea of how, in this perspective, the government itself is the solution. So more control is the solution to having, this idea of control. But how public schools have stepped in and said, we will not only not share a child's journey through gender and sexuality from age 5 to 18, but we are instead entrusted with the sacred responsibility of making sure that parents don't know what's going on behind closed doors, because that parent is going to exert an authority that does not allow that child to grow to be who they want to be. So,
and to be clear, you're not presenting a boogeyman here. I personally know teachers who were instructed to not disclose information about a gender reassign or gender ideology change or a name change. So it's not a boogeyman. This isn't an article we read online.
This is a very real thing.
But in that scenario, there is a devaluing of one authority, the parental authority, and then an assuming of another authority.
In order that a person might be self-expressive individualism, our first kind of topic we discussed, could be exalted.
Yeah, and so I see another way. I don't know if you feel this pressure as a pastor, Chris, but I think parents feel this pressure too. because external authority is devalued right now, I feel the pressure not just to tell someone what to do, but to convince them it's good for them. Like the only way for me to get you to do this thing is if I can just plead with you that it's the best thing for you to do.
Incentivization, right?
Now, I believe that all of God's commands, Jesus says, or John says of Jesus, his commands are not burdensome.
Yeah.
So I totally believe that when God commands something, he's actually removing a burden. It's for our good. He's telling me how to operate faithfully. But the Bible begins with the command, not with the fruit of the command.
Yeah.
I think where we've come is in order for a parent to get a child to do something, or a pastor to convince a congregant, or any sort of authority relationship, employee to be convinced by an employer, what actually is happening is not the authority saying, this is what you ought to do because of the objective moral truth. It's saying, I want to get you to do this thing.
And here's how you'll benefit.
But guess what? The one in lesser authority is now actually with greater authority because they get to determine, is it good for me to do that?
Yeah.
And so I sense this as a pastor, and I can even find myself counseling out of a place of the first thing I need to do is convince someone that they're now convinced this is the best option for them rather than presenting some sort of objective truth outside of them. So I think that these types of things, they do come to bear on our everyday life. Let's talk about the origins. So Truman brings up two guys, one who I think most people have heard of, which is Karl Marx. The term Marxism has been bandied about a lot in the past 4 to 6 years. You might not know what Marxism is, but you probably heard the name. Friedrich Nietzsche is probably a guy that most people haven't heard of, though.
Except for one of his famous statements, right?
Yes.
Yes.
But he's a lesser known guy. I mean, I think the only reason I knew of Nietzsche before this past year was because I read Timothy Keller, who talked about him. But he's not a very common guy. However, Truman shows that Marx's thought and Nietzsche's thought really get us to a point today. Here's where they agree. Both Marx and Nietzsche agree that God does not exist. Okay? Now, they differ on what to do because God does not exist. So if God does not exist, then there is no objective exterior morality, because objective exterior morality comes from a God outside of you.
Yep.
So what Marx and Nietzsche have said is no God, no objective morality. So what do? Well, Marx says we still see moral claims, but those are just because certain classes of people are trying to hold other classes of people under their thumb, right? So
Oppression.
yeah, so if Chris makes a moral claim, it's not because there's something true. It's because Chris wants to hold sway over Josh. And so he's going to use moral claims to push Josh down.
Are you suggesting I do this to you at some point?
No.
Okay.
No, I think we should just fist fight like we always do to decide who wins. So that's Marx. Nietzsche, he goes even further and says there's no God, therefore we need to eliminate all remaining thoughts of God, including objective morality. Nietzsche ends up kind of agreeing with Marx that morality is about power. He has this term called will to power, and basically he's saying, okay, if objective morality doesn't exist, how do we determine between moralities? Well, someone transvaluates their values, meaning they gain power and they enforce their values.
Which led to Nazism.
Yeah. Now, one interesting thing I thought before we evaluate these things, Marx and Nietzsche both believe no God equals no objective morality. Marx and Nietzsche both believe that morality is coercive. It's used to manipulate and oppress.
Yeah.
But they disagree on who's doing the manipulation. So Marx believes that a higher class of people, the bourgeoisie, is holding down the proletariat, the working class. And so the reason why there's morality about kindness and gentleness and self-control, these things you might see in Christianity, the reason for those moralities is because that makes a good working class.
Yeah.
So the upper class is holding down the lower class with morality. Nietzsche completely disagrees. He says this idea from Christianity of the weak being valued over the strong and the humble being valued over the prideful. This is just the lower class trying to keep the upper class in check. So we can see there this inconsistency that both men agree no God equals no objective morality. Both men agree that morality is merely used to manipulate, but they think different people are manipulating. And so we see just that there's an inconsistency there of who is actually winning in these moral claims. Chris, brief thoughts on Marx or Nietzsche's ideas of objective morality.
I don't think there's too much to be said about it. I mean, I think you stated the facts of the matter pretty well, but I do think so. We had spoken a number of weeks back about the idea of the social imaginary?
Social imaginary. How the elite ideas trickle down to the popular.
Yeah, nobody's read Marx, nobody's read Nietzsche. I mean, that's just not been a thing. I mean, unless you go through philosophy class in college. Even then, you may not actually read those guys. You probably have to get to a 200 or 300 level philosophy class to actually read them instead of just hearing about the terms. So I think it's important to see this and recognize. I had made the remark, Nietzsche leads to Nazism. But it's true. Nietzsche does lead to Nazism.
Why?
Why? Because it's so a great phrase, the consequences of ideas. We don't typically think these things through. We don't typically think, what is the consequence of believing that only the strong survive, right? I mean, that's a great thing if we're playing sports, like you hear that, only the strong survive. Great. So do well. That doesn't work very well when you get somebody who is in a position, as Hitler was, to feel as though he is oppressed by people underneath him, and he wants to exalt a ruling class who is superior to everybody underneath them. And so you literally, I mean, one of Nietzsche's terms was the Ubermensch, which is German for Superman. And that's literally where we get Naziist thought about, a superior race. And so we think social imaginary, does Nietzsche really matter? Well, Nietzsche mattered to the Germans in the 1930s and 40s significantly, but nobody's thinking in those terms. Nobody's thinking like, oh, I read Nietzsche, and so this is therefore what's happening with Hitler.
It's in the imagination of...
Yes, and so everybody hears it, they think it, they cultivate it, because there's somebody who takes it, packages it, and brings it to them. The same thing happened with Marx when it comes to the Soviet Union and with communist China. Marx's thoughts about how the lower class can actually be brought into a place of equality or even superiority. And I do, what's interesting is you look at some authors that people may actually have read more than they've read Nietzsche or Marx. George Orwell is commonly cited right now because a lot of the privacy invasion that are taking place by big tech or by the government itself. But books like 1984 and Animal Farm, both of those books stand out, I think, for people as a warning, because it's what's interesting is that Orwell himself identified as a socialist. But he saw the failures inherent in a system that went to this, if you take it all the way out, what will be the consequences of a train of thought that goes here? And I think just to understand, this is serious stuff. This is not just philosophy. This has impacted millions upon millions. And in the case of Soviet Union, China, Germany, it has cost tens of millions of lives, because people in positions of power have adopted worldviews that called for this type of action.
Because if you're in power and there's no exterior morality, then you do what you want.
Yes,
because
you
you're
are
in
the
power.
one. Exactly.
So I think this is actually where I find both Marx and Nietzsche tragically ironic, is both of them are talking about power structures and about how morality is only about getting power over one another. And I think that both of them have this kind of spirit that religious people exercise their power in a domineering way, and it leads to war, and it leads to lack of peace, and it leads to conflict. And yet, fundamental to their ideas of morality is war and conflict.
Right.
Because, if you and I disagree on fundamental objective truths of morality, I might try to either persuade you or coerce you under my objective, right? That might lead to conflict.
Sure.
But if there's no objective and you and I disagree, then we now have to fight over
Exactly.
it. Because one of us needs to win.
Yep.
And you see that actually in Nietzsche, he is not afraid of the consequences of ideas.
Yep.
He wants to go to the logical end. And so Nietzsche says, there's no God, which means there's no objective morality, which means we have to use power to enforce our will And so he's actually advocating for people to gain power to assert their
Yes.
morality. Chris, does that not sound like our current country? Does
Yeah.
it not sound like our current country? Because the truth of the situation is most people in our country have moved away from some sort of objective religious criteria for morality.
Yep.
And what do we see? War between two parties. And I'll use the word war because though we're not taking up arms, I mean, the vitriol between two parties, well, why is it so volatile? Because you need the will to power to win. And so because Republicans and Democrats aren't appealing to a higher authority they both agree on and disagreeing on the consequences,
Yep.
they don't have a higher authority to appeal to, so they have to fight to gain power.
Yeah.
And that's the only means of advancing morality.
Yeah.
So what's tragically ironic, as I said, is Marx and Nietzsche, in an attempt to say, let's get away from this manipulative morality, they just give another manipulative morality.
Which is even more, kind of the point of Animal Farm. If you read Animal Farm, you start out with all animals are equal. And then it gets to the end, all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. So it's, yes, we're going to right all of the wrongs, and in the process you end up creating greater wrongs than existed in the first place.
Chris, Nietzsche has an idea. There's this famous paragraph from his writing where the madman goes into the streets, and the madman proclaims God is dead. And maybe you've seen the movie God's Not Dead. And it's the opposite of that, right? It's the combating of an atheistic worldview. What Nietzsche is doing in this madman speech is not saying God is dying, but saying God is gone. He's completely gone from our psyches. He's completely gone from our thinking. And then this speech, very poetically, the madman says, what have we done? We've unchained the earth from the sun. And so this picture of unchaining the earth from the sun, like imagine in your minds, which is the place where you imagine generally, imagine a chain going from the earth to the sun. We know in God's providence that they're in somewhat fixed places and they stay at a somewhat fixed distance. But imagine what happens if the sun, the center of morality, is now unchained from the earth and the earth is just floating in formless space away from the sun.
Yeah.
That's the picture Nietzsche's giving us, and he's actually saying that's a good thing. He's saying we need to go the final step and say, because God is dead, we need to unchain humanity from morality and let it float away. Now, I guess maybe I want to focus on the pragmatics of what that leads to, because I think that's in large part where we're getting as a society is we have become unchained.
Yeah.
And Chris, talk to me a little bit about the logical ends of an idea that says God is no longer here. We're unchained from God. He can't tell us what to do. He can't manipulate us.
Well, what was the logical end for Nietzsche?
Insane asylum.
Yeah. Nietzsche went crazy, right? And it wasn't because he had been oppressed by Christian morality. His own mind and his own self-drivenness and this pursuit of something that is so out of character with how humanity was made led him to go insane. I mean, so that's an outworking that is a problem. That's a consequence for adopting those types of things. Can you go a little bit further as far as what you want to kind of get at with the question?
Yeah, I get so you mentioned earlier that we don't often think of the consequences of ideas. Sure. I think it's somewhat attractive to think I can be free to determine myself. I'm not chained to any system of religion. Sure. But that attractiveness wanes as soon as we start to think about what that actually means.
Sure. Yeah. It's I think that's helpful to talk about the appeal, the attraction of it, because from a Christian perspective, you look at the Bible, what was the first thing that happened that brought sin into the world? It was
unchain the earth from the sun.
Exactly. It was God knows if you eat this, you'll be like him. And he doesn't want you to eat this because he
God
knows
provides external objective morality.
Exactly.
And the human says, cut the chain.
Yep. don't need it. So that happens, and that's kind of been an issue for thousands of years now, is that humanity has dealt with this.
Issue, yeah.
And this is fundamental to the human heart, fundamental to the fallen human heart that we inherited from Adam and Eve themselves, is this desire and this idea that it's always going to be better if we unchain ourselves, right? It's always going to be better. And I think at no point in human history have we observed a culture that has been as vocal and in love with and in pursuit of this as a value than what we see in the 21st century West. I can't think of anything, and that even goes beyond pagan Rome in the first century. That goes beyond, places where you had people who were doing some things that were just pretty off the wall, but they thought in terms of philosophy and ethics and tried to kind of work within certain parameters. We just don't even think like that anymore. We've abandoned the idea that ethics should even be considered. I mean, it was interesting. The other night I was watching The Office, and it was a business ethics episode where Holly Flax comes in and starts talking about what's appropriate to do in the workplace and that kind of a thing. And the only person who actually said anything was Oscar, who said, that's not ethics. These questions about taking a note, a post-it note home, that kind of a thing. And I think that's reflected that most people don't think about what actually is right or wrong anymore, because we have so, to go back to Nietzsche's deal, is to say that God is dead, that is really 19th century German theological philosophy also adopted the same mentality, and it's very sad because it really filtered in a lot of things. But the idea of, supernaturalism, that's not going to be a thing anymore, right? And so you have guys like Friedrich Schleiermacher who step in and say, we're going to demythologize, desupernaturalize everything pertaining to Christianity, and we're just going to be left with what is kind of sentimental, effectively. And so when Nietzsche does his deal,
which is ultimately where Nietzsche gets to, is to say, since there's no objective morality, and since morality is oppressive, it's just about taste.
Sure, yeah.
And that's where David Hume ended up getting to, and you don't have to remember all these guys, but David Hume ended up getting to the fact that because all we know is what we see, we can't really know anything. I mean, Hume went so far as to say we can't know that gravity exists because we can't see gravity. We can just see that generally apples fall from trees. So he was an extreme skeptic, which led him, I think the phrase is that it's not that murder is wrong, it's just that humans say boo to murder. And so Hume, because he says we can't observe exterior morality, he says all we can really say about murder is that we don't like it. And that's where Nietzsche gets as well, is to say that morality is just distasteful. And where Truman helps us here is he says, okay, what is the kind of language we use about something that's wrong?
Sure.
I didn't like when you said that. It hurt my feelings. It was offensive to me. So,
or even I don't want to.
So you take about let's take a sexist comment, right? So a man makes a sexist comment against a woman. Is it only immoral if it offends her, or is there some sort of objective morality?
Sure.
Because that's a distinguishing factor here. Is the current morality would say it's immoral if it's offensive because it offended someone because they didn't like it.
Yeah.
But that's a subjective changing criteria. There needs to be some sort of objective, it is or is not. And I think that's part of where this trickles down. I would say another part of where we see this idea, so one is, like I said, if you're a parent, we've talked about authority, if you're a parent and your child disobeys you, you might be tempted to think and to tell them, I didn't like it when you did that. But the truth of the matter is, it was wrong when they did that. From a biblical perspective, it's quite striking in the vice lists in Romans and in 1 Timothy that among sexuality is also disobedience to parents. Right? And so the Bible is telling us not just that it's wrong because you didn't like it, but it's wrong because it's wrong.
Right.
And that is the difference between subjective and objective morality. I think another place where we see some of Marx and Nietzsche's thought, we had two extensive discussions about abortion. Chris, one of the things I noticed as people were reacting to the overturn of Dobbs is people saying this is an example of white supremacy. This is an example of the religious right wanting power.
Patriarchalism.
Okay, so yeah, patriarchy, religious right, white supremacy. That's directly Marxist thought.
Correct.
And that's not a slam. This is just an observation because what Marx believed is since there's no objective morality, then morality is just humans using terms to get power,
Yep.
which means any moral claim is really a political claim.
Yep.
That's Marx's own
Right.
thought.
Exactly.
So therefore, when Chris, a pro-lifer, votes in legislation about pro-life, it's not because he believes in an objective morality about the life of an unborn child.
To assert power.
He wants power.
Yeah.
And I think we have to say, oh, no, actually, it's about objective morality.
Right.
It's not a power struggle at all.
Yep.
It's not an assertion of power over another human being as much as it is a belief in an objective moral claim that leads me to want to stop evil.
Yeah.
That's directly Marxist thought.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think, without stepping on any toes by saying this, this is an observation, I believe a factual observation, so I'm just going to preface it by saying this, but I do think that this is probably why those on the political left in the United States function in a certain way that almost seems like they're speaking a different language than those who are on the political right. Because traditionally speaking, those who are on the political right maintain certain values that are, we would probably say, abstract, transcendent values that can be identified as abstract, transcendent values for what they are. Meaning those on the political right will typically find themselves in a place where they identify with an organized religion in some capacity that has an authoritative document that governs how they live. When it comes to the political left, that has gone less and less and less, it's exerted less and less influence to the point now where you see certain political leaders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is a prime example of this, a woman who's, I think, about your age, something like that, probably late
older,
20s, early 30s, something like that. And the way that political action is pursued is through power, right? And so what's interesting is that you may hear these claims from those on the political left saying, patriarchy, white supremacy, those are the types of things that get bandied about as like, this is the reason they're doing this. And that's because those on the political left truly believe that that is the only thing that is actually defining how government functions. And so the belief is that classist struggles are real. And so you need to ensure that those who are in the minority classes, and I'm just talking race, I'm talking different representative minorities, need to be heard in such a way that that it's ensured that those who are in the majority do not exert power over them. And so when you look at somebody like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez talking about climate change and minority rights in different ways, the reason why she seems so virulent in her pursuit of this and seems so aggressive is because fundamental to her belief system, fundamental to her political beliefs and her personal beliefs is Marxist thought that says, and I guess in some sense Nietzsche, but there's the idea like you fight, and so, that is how you succeed.
Marx ultimately has a somewhat positive view of humanity because he thinks we can achieve utopia, but the way to achieve there is combat.
Yes, exactly.
Right? And so you think about like when you have an idea that you're going to create peace in a territory, you get there through war.
Yes.
Right? And so
which is why revolutions accompanied all communist takeovers, right? It wasn't a peaceful transition where the communists came in saying, we have a great vision for the future, let's vote for change. It was fight.
Right.
And so, one danger as we look at the West today and as we look at the United States specifically is to say, don't be surprised when conflict breaks out. There's a reason why a couple summers ago we experienced racial rioting. And it wasn't simply because people were upset, it's because fomenting this was this atmosphere that says the only way you're going to find racial justice exist is if you shout down and you literally destroy and dismantle anything that suggests this other group, the other, we talked about that a few weeks ago, the other, they need to be taken out of power because their power means your disempowerment.
Yeah. The last thing I'll say about Nietzsche and Marx is Nietzsche put forth this idea that we are all moral artists. We are all moral self-creators.
That's a word for it.
And I I guess I would just briefly respond to that by saying that's a terrible place to be as a human.
Yeah.
It sounds attractive, but Chris, when someone wants me to do a project, I really want to see the end before I start, because the end of it kind of helps me in the middle of it know when I'm making a mistake.
Sure. Yep.
So when I first learned to drywall, I wanted to watch someone do each step of the process and see the end of the process, because I wanted to know where I was making mistakes and when I could stop failures. And actually, when I learned to drywall, the man who taught me, he had a story of the first time he learned to drywall by himself. And if you're familiar with drywalling at all, you have to sand very, very fine, or else you get to the end and you have an inch of drywall and you're looking at 2 days of sanding.
Yeah.
And it's awful.
Yes, very awful.
So I was protected in that circumstance by someone outside of me telling me where the pitfalls were, what the goal I'm trying to achieve is.
Yeah.
What's so sad about current views of religion outside of us is that we're telling humans, go about your life, but I'm not going to tell you where the pitfalls are or what the goal is.
Yeah, figure it out.
And so you have people who are just trying any and all things to pursue pleasure and avoid pain, but they're causing themselves pain and the pleasure's not satisfying, all because we've told people that the worst thing for you to do is have someone else tell you how to live.
Yeah.
When we believe as Christians, the absolute best thing for me is for the God who created me to let me know ahead of time.
Exactly.
Tell me where my pitfalls are going to be. Tell me what vices are going to hurt me, that they look pleasurable, but they're going to be painful. Tell me what the end of my life is supposed to be.
Yep.
Tell me.
Yep.
And I think actually one of the saddest things my wife and I have discussed is the idea of like parents leaving to their children the choosing of a gender. Like how my wife had a hard enough time figuring out how to be a woman when she knew she was a woman.
Right.
I mean, like every woman that I've talked to, adolescence is just a painful process.
Right. Yep.
But it's painful while knowing who you are and what you're supposed to be and where you're going. How much more painful when we're just allowing people to create themselves. And I think that's directly coming from Nietzsche. And from a Christian perspective, the way to protect people is to allow a wise and good God in that garden with Adam and Eve to say, this fruit's bad for you.
Yep.
Look at the rest of the fruit. So that's it for this episode. Thanks for taking some time to think with us this morning.